The stagecoach lurched violently as its front wheels slammed into a deep rut, throwing Evangeline Helene forward against the cracked leather bench. She flung her arm across her three boys, anchoring them before they could tumble into the cramped footwell. Outside, the lead horse shrieked, its hooves skidding in loose gravel, as the animal panicked near the edge of a shallow wash. The whole rig tilted dangerously, the world canting at an angle that made her stomach drop. The driver cursed, sawing at the reins with both hands. One of the leather traces snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Then, through the swirling cloud of alkali grit kicked up by their near disaster, a lone rider appeared. He wore a buckskin shirt gone dark with sweat across the shoulders, his hair braided long on both sides, no hat. He swung from his saddle at a full run, boots hitting the ground, before his horse had even stopped and seized the panicked animal's bridle with both hands. He planted his feet and leaned back, every muscle in his arms and shoulders straining against the frantic power of a terrified horse and the weight of the coach behind it. For several long heartbeats, the outcome hung in balance, raw human strength against animal panic and iron momentum. The horse finally stilled, blowing steam in the cool evening air, sides heaving like bellows. Evangeline's youngest, Luke, only 6 years old, pressed his face to the dusty window and whispered, "Is that Mr. Redhawk, Ma, the one in the letter?" The rider looked up toward the coach window. His eyes were dark, steady, and unmistakably Lakota high cheekbones, copper skin, black hair gleaming in the slanting October light of 1890. The name on the contract she had signed back in White River, K. Redhawk, landowner, widower, father of 3 in need of a housekeeper and tutor, had never said a single word about that. The coach set them down on the edge of Bronze Canyon Valley, just as the sun touched the western ridgeline, painting the whole world in shades of rust and shadow. The driver handed down her scuffed leather valise without meeting her eyes, collected his fare from the county voucher she presented, and rattled away down the rutted track, leaving a widow, 3 boys, and 1 piece of luggage standing alone in wind that smelled of sagebrush and distant rain. Evangeline Helene was 31 years old, born in Bavaria, raised in Boston, after her father brought the family to America when she was 12. She had married a clerk named Thomas Helene, borne 3 sons, and buried her husband 2 winters past, when typhoid fever took him in the span of 4 days. The debts he left behind were large enough to swallow their rented rooms, and the Ladies' Charitable Committee of White River had offered her a way out, serve as domestic manager and tutor on a frontier homestead room. And board provided, and her boys could stay with her instead of being parceled out to distant relatives or worse, placed on one of the orphan trains that carried unwanted children west to work on farms and ranches. She had signed the contract without reading every clause. Desperation was a poor lawyer. Ahead of her now lay the homestead, a small frame house built on short wooden pilings to keep the floor above spring flooding, a narrow porch running the width of the front, a lean-to barn, a sagging chicken coop, and a fenced patch of corn struggling against the dry season. Beyond that, the land rolled away in tawny waves toward distant buttes, broken only by a thin line of cottonwoods marking the course of a creek, the only free-running water for miles. The rider from the road sat on the porch steps now, hat pushed back, sleeves rolled to the elbows, moccasins dusty and worn. His braids hung over his shoulders, and a necklace of bone and colored trade beads rested against the open collar of his shirt. There was no feathered war bonnet, no painted shield, no ceremonial regalia, just the quiet, coiled readiness of a man used to hard work and harder fights. Evangeline crossed the yard with her boys clinging to her skirts, Peter and Henry flanking her, Luke tucked behind. Her heart pounded for reasons that had nothing to do with the stagecoach accident. "Mr. Redhawk?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "The committee in White River sent me. The contract said you needed a housekeeper and someone to mind 3 children." He studied her for a long moment, then the boys, then the scuffed valise at her feet. When he spoke, his English was careful, each word chosen with precision. "I am Kanji Redhawk," he said. "I did not ask the committee for a woman. I asked for a John Deere plow that does not break every third furrow. His gaze flicked to the boys again. They send me this instead. Behind Evangeline's shoulder, the stagecoach was already disappearing into the twilight. She felt suddenly sharply how far she was from any neighbor who might take her in, how alone they were on this stretch of open territory. I was told there is respectable work here, she said, lifting her chin. Room and board in exchange for keeping house and helping with schooling. I signed a contract. She stopped. Kanji had stood tall and lean, and from this close she could see a faint scar running from his jaw down past his collarbone, an old bullet track that had healed badly. You signed with the ladies' committee, he said. It was not a question. They did not tell you I am Lakota. Evangeline swallowed. They did not, she admitted. For a moment, something almost like sympathy flickered in his expression. Then it was gone, replaced by the same wary neutrality. There is a room at the back, he said. My children sleep in the loft. Yours can share the small room by the kitchen. We rise before dawn. If you cook and teach letters, I will not ask more. He turned toward the barn, without waiting for her answer. Peter, her eldest at 11, whispered, Ma, are we staying? She looked at the house, the darkening sky, the long empty road behind them. Yes, she said quietly. We are staying. On the ridge above the homestead, silhouetted against the last copper light, 2 men sat on horseback watching. Abraham Cutter was a cattle baron who owned most of Bronze Canyon Valley by deed, intimidation, or legal manipulation. He was 52 thick, through the chest and shoulders, his beard gone gray at the edges. He wore a fine wool coat even in the heat, and his saddle was worked leather with silver conchos, but it was his mind, not his money, that made him dangerous. He had studied law in Kansas City before coming west, and he knew how to twist statutes and contracts until they screamed. The man beside him, Skinny Steve, was his foreman. Lean as a whip with a drooping mustache and eyes that never seemed to blink. From up here, the creek glinted like a silver thread, running from Kanji's allotment down through the valley toward Cutter's sprawling ranch. The widows signed Cordelia's contract, Skinny Steve asked. Every word, Cutter said, voice pleasant. She thinks it is a simple employment agreement. She does not realize it makes her a legal guardian of the property itself, not just the children. Which means when we testify that she witnessed unsafe conditions, the territorial judge can void Redhawk's allotment and transfer guardianship to a more suitable party. He smiled without warmth. Namely me. What if she refuses to testify? Then her boys become wards of the county under the moral fitness clause. The Orphan Train Society has already been notified. 3 healthy boys between 6 and 11 will fetch good placements. Cutter gathered his reins. Either way, by spring that creek runs through my land. The trap was not just closed. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering, every escape route sealed before Evangeline even knew she was caught. Inside the small house, lamplight threw shadows across rough plank walls. The main room held a table, 4 mismatched chairs, a cast-iron cook stove, and shelves stacked with tin plates and cups. A narrow hallway led to 2 small bedrooms and a ladder to the loft. 3 children appeared from the loft as Evangeline set down her valise. 2 girls, dark-haired and solemn, and a boy perhaps Peter's age, all watching her with the same careful silence their father had shown. Kanji spoke to them in Lakota, his voice softer than it had been outside. The eldest girl nodded and gestured toward the back room. I am Winona, she said in halting English. That is my sister Tallulah, my brother Maddo. We welcome you. Evangeline smiled, though her heart was still racing. Thank you, Winona. These are my sons, Peter, Henry, and Luke. The children stared at each other across the lamplight, sizing each other up the way children do, looking for threat or friendship. Luke tugged on Evangeline's sleeve. "Ma, what's an allotment?" he whispered loudly, stumbling over the unfamiliar word he'd heard the stagecoach driver mention. Henry elbowed him. "Hush." Matto's jaw tightened, but Winona laid a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that spoke of practice of having absorbed many such questions and slights before. Evangeline knelt to Luke's level. "It means Mr. Redhawk owns this land," she said gently. "The government gave it to him to farm." "Why?" Luke asked his 6-year-old curiosity, undimmed. "Because it is his by right," she said firmly, though she was still learning what that meant herself. That night, Evangeline lay awake in the narrow back room, listening to her boys breathe in the darkness beside her. Through the thin walls, she could hear the faint creak of the loft boards as Kanji's children settled. She thought about the contract in her valise, the one she had been so grateful to sign. She thought about the way Mrs. Cordelia Finch, the committee chairwoman, had smiled when she pressed the pen into Evangeline's hand and said, "This is a wonderful opportunity for a woman of your situation." And she thought about the look in Kanji Redhawk's eyes when he said, "They did not tell you I am Lakota." Whatever she had walked into, it was far more complicated than a simple job-keeping house. The next morning, Evangeline woke to the sound of hammering. She bolted upright, heart-pounding, and rushed to the door, still in her nightdress hair, half-braided and falling loose. Her boys stumbled after her, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Down by the creek, 2 men in dusty work clothes and broad-brimmed hats were driving rough posts into the muddy bank building, a crude wooden gate meant to divert water away from Kanji's land and toward the larger properties downstream. Kanji strode down the slope from the barn, a Winchester rifle in one hand, a felt hat shadowing his eyes now. He moved with the kind of economy of motion that came from muscle memory, not thought. "That bank is mine," he called, voice carrying across the open ground. "Pull the posts." One of the cowhands straightened hammer still in hand and smirked. "You don't own water, Redhawk. Mr. Cutter's got papers from the territorial surveyors say this creek is for the valley's common benefit. You just squatting on it." The second man laughed a mean sound. Evangeline's hands clenched at her sides. Luke pressed into her hip, frightened. She glanced back into the house, saw the old double-barreled Greener shotgun leaning just inside the door, left there by Kanji, she realized now, in case of exactly this. She grabbed it, checked the hammers the way her father had taught her long ago in another life, and stepped off the porch in bare feet, the hem of her nightdress dragging through the dry grass. "Leave that gate," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My children are here. I will not have guns going off by the house." The cowhand with the hammer eyed the slim woman in patched cotton leveling iron at him and laughed once as if she were a child playing dress-up. While his attention was split, Kanji moved. He covered the distance in 3 long strides, swung the rifle barrel like a club, and slammed it against the man's wrist. The hammer went flying, splashing into the shallows. The second cowhand swung his own tool in a vicious arc. Kanji took the blow on his shoulder, staggered, then used the momentum to ram the man backward over the half-built gate. They hit the water in a tangle of limbs and mud. Posts cracked, one snapped clean in half. The horses tied nearby squealed and pulled at their reins. Evangeline jerked the shotgun barrel up and to the side, afraid of hitting Kanji, and fired a warning shot into the air instead. The blast echoed off the low hills, rolling away into silence. The cowhands scrambled out of the creek, soaked and furious, but they did not reach for their guns. Not with a rifle and a shotgun, both trained on them now. A third man, Skinny Steve, sat on his horse at the edge of the creek, watching. He spat tobacco juice into the parched earth. "This ain't over," he said. Cutter's got the territorial judge coming in 3 weeks for a proper inspection. We'll see who owns what then." He wheeled his mount and rode off the 2 wet cowhands, stumbling after him on foot, leaving their horses behind. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Evangeline lowered the shotgun hands, shaking now that the danger had passed. Kanji turned to her, water dripping from his shirt, a bruise already darkening along his jaw. "You did not need to do that," he said quietly. "Yes," she answered, meeting his eyes, "I did." Behind them, the boys, all 6 of them, stood in a silent cluster watching. It was the first open shot in what the valley would come to call the Water War. 3 days later, Evangeline woke to find the well dry. She lowered the bucket again and again, but it came up empty, the rope scraping against stone with a hollow sound. Panic clawed at her throat. Water was life on the frontier. Without it, they could not cook, could not wash, could not survive more than a few days. Kanji examined the well and then walked the perimeter, reading signs in the trampled earth that Evangeline could not see. "Someone blocked the spring that feeds it," he said finally, his voice flat. "Piled rocks into the underground channel. The water is flowing elsewhere now." "Can we fix it?" "Yes. But it will take days to dig out the obstruction. And we still need water now." They spent the morning hauling buckets from the creek a 1/4 mile away until Evangeline's shoulders burned and her hands blistered. The children helped even little Luke, struggling with a pail half his size, sloshing water at every step. That evening, Kanji rode to the spring source and found fresh boot prints, 2 sets leading back toward Cutter's land. "They are trying to drive us off without firing a shot," he said when he returned. "No water, no crops, no food. No food, no choice but to leave." Evangeline, scrubbing pots with creek water heated on the stove, felt anger crystallize into something cold and hard. "Then we dig," she said, "and we do not leave." For 2 days, Kanji and Mata worked in the cramped, dark space beneath the well, clearing rocks and debris from the underground channel while Peter and Henry hauled away the rubble. On the 3rd day, water began to trickle, then flow, then gush. When the bucket came up full and cold and clear, the children cheered. But Evangeline knew this was only the beginning. In White River, the nearest town, the story twisted and mutated within hours. By the time Evangeline rode in 2 days later with Peter and Henry to buy flour and lamp oil, men at the Rusty Nail Saloon were already telling an entirely different version. The Indian had attacked Cutter's men without provocation in front of a terrified white woman and her 3 innocent boys. Mothers pulled their children aside as Evangeline walked past the mercantile. A drunk leaning against the hitching rail muttered loud enough for her to hear, "That committee gone crazy, sending a respectable widow to live with a savage." Evangeline kept her eyes forward, but her cheeks burned. Before she could reach the store entrance, a group of boys' sons of ranchers and cowhands threw clumps of dried horse manure at Henry. One struck him on the shoulder, leaving a dark smear. "Indian lover," the tallest boy yelled. Henry spun, fists raised, but Evangeline caught his arm. "No," she said sharply. "Not here." She shielded him with her body as another missile hit her shawl, splattering across the fabric. Sheriff Rupert Doyle, a heavy man with a yellowed mustache from years of chewing tobacco, stepped off the boardwalk with a folded document in his hand. He moved with the lazy confidence of a man who knew the law would bend whichever way he pushed it. But something in his expression, a tightness around the eyes, a hesitation in his step, suggested discomfort beneath the bravado. "You, Mrs. Evangeline Helene?" he asked. "I am," she said. "You signed this contract with the Ladies' Charitable Committee." He unfolded it, revealing dense text in small print, but his hands trembled slightly. "I am obliged to inform you of its full terms, seeing as there has been an incident at the Redhawk property." He tapped a section near the bottom with one thick finger. Section 7, subsection C. As legal domestic guardian, you are required to report any conditions deemed unsafe or morally unfit for Christian upbringing. Should such conditions be confirmed by territorial authority, the minor children become wards of the county and property guardianship transfers to a party deemed suitable by the court. Evangeline's breath caught. I never agreed to that. You signed it, ma'am. Your signature is right here. He pointed but then looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Now I am told there was gunfire at the property. Violence in front of children. The judge will want your testimony when he conducts his inspection. Doyle's voice dropped. If you testify truthfully about what you witnessed, the court will ensure your boys are placed in good homes back east. Safe homes. Away from undesirable influences. The words hit like a fist to the stomach. Are you threatening to take my children? Doyle's jaw worked. For a moment he seemed on the verge of saying something else, something genuine. Then the mask of official authority snapped back into place. I am informing you of your legal obligations, Mrs. Helene. The orphan train leaves from Omaha on the 15th of November. That is 4 weeks from today. Hoofbeats sounded on the packed dirt street. Kanji reined in at the hitching post, his expression unreadable, as he took in the filth on Evangeline's shawl. The way Peter and Henry crowded close to her sides, the sheriff holding the contract like a weapon. He set a burlap sack of coffee and salt on the wagon seat without a word. Then to the sheriff, he said quietly, You talk about trains for her boys again, Doyle. You say it where I can hear. Doyle's fingers rested on the butt of his Colt revolver, but he only tipped his hat eyes troubled. Just ensuring the law is understood, Redhawk. Good day, Mrs. Helene. He walked away, and Evangeline noticed something odd in the way his shoulders sagged, the way he glanced back once, as if carrying a weight he could not set down. That evening, by lamplight at the kitchen table, Evangeline read the contract for the first time with genuine attention. Kanji sat across from her silent as she worked her way through the dense legal language. Peter, old enough to understand something was wrong, sat on the floor with his brothers trying to keep them occupied with a game of checkers. The contract was a masterpiece of deception. On its surface, it was exactly what she had believed, a standard employment agreement for domestic service. But buried in the subsections were clauses that redefined her role entirely. She was not merely a housekeeper. She was a legal domestic guardian, with fiduciary responsibility for the property itself. If she reported unsafe conditions, and the contract defined unsafe so broadly as to include exposure to violent altercation, or cohabitation with persons of questionable moral standing, the court could declare the homestead unsuitable and transfer its administration to another party. Her testimony was the linchpin. Without it, Cutter had no case. With it, Kanji would lose everything, and if she refused to testify, the contract included a clause that automatically triggered a county review of her fitness as a guardian, which would almost certainly result in her boys being removed. It is a snare, she said finally, her voice hollow. No matter what I do, someone loses. Kanji leaned back in his chair. Cutter did not write this himself. He is not that clever. He hired someone. Mrs. Finch signed it as the committee representative. But someone else wrote it. Kanji's jaw tightened. This is not about water. This is about erasing me from land my wife's family used for 3 generations. When the Dawes Act passed in 1887, they said Lakota could claim allotments if we took up farming. I filed in 1888. It took 2 years to get approval. I thought if I followed their rules, if I plowed and planted and sent my children to school, they would leave us alone. His voice was flat. I was wrong. What happened to your wife? His hands stilled on the table. 3 years ago, Ayana and our youngest daughter, Kimimela, were coming back from town in the wagon. A cowhand from Cutter's ranch, drunk, fired what he called a warning shot. The bullet went through Ayana's chest. Kimimela fell when the horses bolted. She broke her neck. He paused. Sheriff Doyle investigated, called it an accidental death. The cowhand paid a $5 fine. Evangeline's throat tightened. I am so sorry. So am I. He looked at her directly. But if you need to leave, I will take you to the rail station in Cheyenne. I will not let your boys be taken because of me. She stared down at the contract, at the impossible choice it represented. Then she thought about Thomas, her gentle, bookish husband, who had loved order and predictability, who would have been horrified by this violent, lawless place. She had spent 2 years feeling guilty for surviving him, for moving forward, when he could not. But Thomas would not have wanted her to sacrifice their sons to preserve his memory. She folded the contract carefully and set it aside. No, she said. There has to be another way. There is not. Then we will make one. Life at the homestead became a strange, tense kind of dance. Evangeline scrubbed the house-mended clothing worn thin at the knees and elbows and turned one corner of the main room into a makeshift schoolroom. Planks laid across barrels for desks, a slate board nailed to the wall, primers and McGuffey readers borrowed from the church. She drilled the boys, all 6 of them now, on letters and arithmetic and basic geography, using an old Rand McNally atlas that showed the Transcontinental Railroad and the new states of the West. Kanji worked the fields at dawn, checking the irrigation ditches, and rode fence lines at midday to inspect for breaks or sabotage. He checked the creek level every evening, watching for signs that Cutter's men had tried again to divert the flow. He taught the boys skills Evangeline could not. How to read animal tracks in the soil, the difference between a coyote's print and a dog's, the way a fresh track would crumble versus an old one. How to judge the creek's depth and current by the way the surface rippled. How to tell if a waterhole had gone alkaline by the insects that avoided it. The children, initially wary of each other, began to merge into a single unit. Peter taught Maddo how to sound out difficult English words. Winona showed Henry how to stitch a torn seam so it would hold under strain. Tallulah and Luke, closest in age, collected eggs together each morning, bickering cheerfully in a mixture of English and the few Lakota words Luke was learning. One evening, as the sky darkened to deep indigo coyotes came in close, drawn by the smell of the chicken coop, Evangeline heard the high-pitched yipping, that eerie, undulating cry, and felt the hair on her arms stand up. Luke clutched at her skirts, frightened. "Ma, what is that?" "Coyotes," she said, trying to sound calm. "They smell the chickens." "Will they eat us?" Luke asked, eyes wide. "No, sweetheart, but we need to scare them away." "Lantern," Kanji said. He pressed the glass and metal frame into her hand, his fingers briefly enclosing hers. The touch was brief, practical, but she felt the warmth of it, like a brand. "Stand on the porch. Hold it high. Make a long shadow. They do not like what they cannot understand." He moved out into the yard, becoming part of the darkness at first. Then the lantern's glow threw his silhouette huge and distorted across the packed earth. The coyotes slunk closer, eyes reflecting green in the light like polished stones. Kanji angled himself so the light was at his back, making himself appear larger, and let out a sharp whistle that cut through the night. When one of the animals darted toward the coop, he fired the Winchester. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt at the coyote's paws, and the pack scattered, yipping, melting back into the darkness. The boys cheered from the doorway. Evangeline realized she had been holding her breath. "You did not need to waste a cartridge," she said as he climbed back onto the porch. "It was not wasted," he answered. "They will remember. Memory is cheaper than losing chickens." She handed him the lantern. Their fingers brushed again in the transfer, lingering for half a heartbeat longer than necessary. The valley deepened around them, full of small dramas and shifting alliances. Dr. Josiah Jasper was a tired man, with thinning hair spectacles mended with wire and the look of someone who had seen too much suffering. He rode out once a week to check on Luke's cough, a wheezing rattle that worsened in the cold mornings, and to leave small parcels of medicine when he could afford it. Over chipped enamel cups of coffee at Evangeline's table, he explained the deeper currents of the valley's politics. How Kanji's allotment had been carved under the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which sought to break up tribal lands into individual homesteads, theoretically to encourage farming, but in practice to open surplus land for white settlement. How Abraham Cutter had been eyeing the creek for years, knowing that control of water meant control of grazing rights for 20 miles in every direction. How the upcoming territorial judge's inspection would determine not just one homestead's fate, but set a precedent for every Lakota allotment in the region. Judge Blackwell is not a bad man, Jasper said carefully, stirring his coffee longer than necessary. But he is old, and he believes in order. If Cutter can make the case that Redhawk's holding is unstable, the judge will rule for what he perceives as the valley's greater good. Evangeline noticed the hesitation in his voice, the way his hand trembled slightly as he set down the cup. At the time, she thought it was only weariness. She did not yet know it was fear. Across the creek, perhaps a quarter-mile downstream, lived Seamus O'Malley, an Irish immigrant with boots too small for his broad feet and dreams too large for the hardscrabble frontier. He battled Cutter's men who, accidentally, drove cattle through his boundary fences every few weeks, trampling his meager crops and scattering his pigs. Kanji helped him mend the barbed wire fences at night, the new steel wire with sharp barbs that had only become widely available in the past few years, working by moonlight, so Cutter's riders would not see. Evangeline sent over stew and cornbread when she could spare it, carried by Peter and Maddo, together a gesture of alliance that did not go unnoticed in the valley. One cold afternoon in late October, returning from Seamus's place along an old wagon track that wound through a stand of yellowing cottonwoods, Kanji reined in beside the charred remains of a small dugout homestead. The sod roof had collapsed inward, the supporting timbers blackened by fire. Whose place was this? Evangeline asked. A man named Thomas Birch. Came out from Ohio in '81. Filed a claim under the Homestead Act. The county said he abandoned it before proving up. Kanji dismounted and kicked at the debris. But I found his grave a mile east unmarked. Skull cracked in the back. Evangeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind cutting through her shawl. Murder. Or accident. Doyle ruled it accidental death. No investigation. Her boot knocked against something metal buried under a collapsed section of wall. She knelt, brushed away the ash, and pried up a rusted tin box, the kind used for storing documents. Inside lay a surveyor's plat map and a leather-bound ledger. The map showed boundaries marked in faded India ink, with Birch's name written in a careful, educated hand. The ledger recorded payments made for land survey filing fees, seed purchases, all the meticulous records of a man trying to build a future. Then halfway through the ledger, something changed. The original entries ended abruptly. Below them, in different ink and a cruder hand, someone had written, "Claim abandoned per territorial statute. Title transferred to A. Cutter per auction sale, October 1882. But the dates did not align. According to Birch's own entries, he had been working the claim as late as September of that year, and according to the surveyor's map, the boundaries described in Cutter's auction overlapped significantly with what was now Kanji's allotment. Someone sold the same land twice, Evangeline said slowly, piecing it together. Or sold land they did not own. Paper against paper. Kanji set his jaw tight. Cutter has legal documents. I have an allotment certificate signed by a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent. We will see which the judge believes." They wrapped the box in a wool blanket and hid it under the wagon's seat, another piece in a puzzle they did not yet know how to solve. Days blurred into weeks. The cottonwoods turned gold, then lost their leaves. The first hard frost came silvering the grass. Evangeline learned the rhythms of the homestead, when to feed the chickens, how to judge if the bread dough had risen enough by pressing her thumb into it, which wild herbs along the creek could be brewed into tea that eased Luke's cough. She learned to read Kanji's silences, to distinguish between the quiet of thought and the quiet of worry. The children bonded in ways she had not anticipated. Peter, serious and responsible, took on the role of eldest among all 6, organizing chores and settling disputes. Henry, mercurial and quick-tempered, found an unexpected friendship with Maddo, and the two of them tracking rabbits through the brush and practicing knife-throwing against a stump behind the barn. Winona, at 13, became a second mother to Tallulah and Luke, teaching them Lakota words and braiding their hair in the mornings. One evening, after the children were asleep, Kanji sat at the table cleaning his Winchester, and Evangeline sat across from him, darning socks by lamplight. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with suspicion. "Your husband," Kanji said quietly, not looking up from his work. "What was he like?" Evangeline paused, needle mid-stitch. "Gentle. Too gentle for the world, perhaps. He was a clerk for a shipping company in Boston. He kept the books, recorded the manifests. He loved numbers because they were predictable. Ordered." She smiled faintly. "He would have hated this place. But you do not." "No," she said, surprised by the truth of it. "I do not. I feel guilty about that sometimes, as if by not hating it, I am forgetting him." Kanji ran an oiled cloth along the rifle barrel. Ayana was fierce. She argued with me about everything, how to plant the corn, which horse to breed, whether to send the children to the mission school. She was never quiet. His hand stilled. I miss the arguments more than anything. For a long time after she died, I thought I had no right to feel anything but grief. But grief is not the same as memory. Memory honors them. Grief only exhausts us. Evangeline set down her darning and looked at him across the lamplight. "You are right," she said softly. "I have been so afraid of dishonoring Thomas that I forgot he would want me to live, to be happy." "And are you happy?" She considered the question honestly. "I am beginning to be." Without thinking, she reached across the table and rested her hand on his. He looked down at it, then up at her. And for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition of shared grief, shared endurance, and the tentative hope of something new. Then she withdrew her hand, and they returned to their separate tasks, but the air between them had changed. When the first week of November arrived, the Ladies' Charitable Committee summoned Evangeline to town for what Cordelia Finch's letter termed a routine progress evaluation. Evangeline rode in alone, leaving the boys with Kanji and Winona. The morning was cold, the sky the color of iron. The committee convened in the back room of the Mercantile beneath a chromolithograph portrait of President Harrison. 3 women sat behind a long table draped in bunting, Cordelia Finch, imperious and unsmiling, Mrs. Adelaide Pruitt, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Dorothy Crane, who ran the boarding house. Sheriff Doyle leaned against the wall in the corner, arms folded, his face pale and drawn. Dr. Jasper stood near the door, his expression ashen. Cordelia Finch opened a leather folio and withdrew Evangeline's contract. Her voice was pleasant, each word carefully chosen like a lawyer presenting evidence. "Mrs. Helena Stana," she began, "we have received reports of concerning incidents at the Redhawk property. Gunfire, violence, physical altercation in the presence of minor children. Additionally, we understand the well was sabotaged, creating conditions of potential drought and privation. She looked up, eyes like flint. As the committee responsible for your placement, we must ask, do you consider the environment suitable for Christian upbringing? Evangeline's stomach twisted. The gunfire was in defense of property rights. The well was repaired. The children are safe and well cared for. A matter of perspective, surely. Mrs. Finch's smile was thin and cold. Mrs. Helene, when you signed this contract, you assumed legal obligations beyond simple employment. Section 7 makes you a guardian of the property, with a duty to report conditions that might endanger the welfare of children. Your testimony will be required when Judge Blackwell conducts his inspection next week. And if I testify that the children are safe and well cared for? Cordelia's smile did not waver. Then the judge will evaluate the entirety of the circumstances. However, I should inform you that we have already filed a preliminary concern with the county. Should your testimony be deemed unreliable, or should you refuse to cooperate, the contract subsection 8B automatically triggers a review of your own fitness as a guardian. The room seemed to tilt. You would take my children. We would ensure they are placed in appropriate homes, yes. The Orphan Train Society has been most helpful. They have identified 3 excellent placements in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Your boys would be separated, of course. It is easier to place them individually. But they would be fed, clothed, and taught a useful trade. Evangeline's vision tunneled. Separated. The word clanged in her skull like a funeral bell. Dr. Jasper cleared his throat, his voice shaking. This is unconscionable, Cordelia. You are blackmailing her. Cordelia turned to him with a look of mild surprise, but beneath it was steel. Doctor, I thought you understood the importance of maintaining order in this valley. Surely you do not wish to be seen as obstructing the committee's charitable work. It would be unfortunate if certain irregularities in your practice came to light. Jasper's face went white as paper. He opened his mouth and closed it, and said nothing more. Sheriff Doyle shifted against the wall, and for the first time, Evangeline saw something in his face, not cruelty, but anguish. His jaw worked as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. Cordelia slid a piece of paper across the table toward Evangeline. This is a prepared statement attesting to unsafe conditions at the Redhawk property. If you sign it before the judge's inspection, we can expedite the transfer of the children to protective custody and spare everyone the unpleasantness of a public hearing. You would be free to seek other employment. A fresh start. Evangeline looked down at the paper at the neat cursive that laid out a catalog of lies, violence, neglect, moral corruption. I will not sign this, she said, her voice like iron. Then we shall see you at the inspection, Mrs. Helene. Cordelia's smile was a blade. Do consider your son's welfare. I would hate for them to suffer because of your stubbornness. Evangeline stood her legs unsteady. As she turned to leave, Sheriff Doyle's voice stopped her. Mrs. Helene? His voice was rough. A word, outside. She followed him into the cold morning air. He walked a few paces away from the mercantile, then stopped his back to her. I am not a good man, he said finally. I have done things I am not proud of. But taking children from their mother. He turned to face her, and she saw genuine torment in his eyes. I want you to know that I will not let that happen. Not if I can help it. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to know you have at least one ally, even if he is a sorry excuse for one. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Evangeline standing alone in the street, her mind racing. That night, by lamplight on the porch, Evangeline told Kanji everything. He listened in silence, his face unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back against the porch post and looked out at the darkness beyond the cottonwoods. "They have built a trap with no exits," he said finally. "If you testify against me, I lose the land. If you refuse, you lose your sons. Either way, Cutter wins. There has to be a way out. There is not. Then we make one," she said fiercely. "You said Cutter did not write that contract himself. Someone with legal training did. What if there is a flaw in it? What if they made a mistake?" Kanji shook his head. "Cutter is many things, but he is not careless. He would have hired the best lawyer he could find. Then we need to be smarter." Evangeline pulled the contract from her apron pocket and spread it on the boards between them. "Show me your allotment certificate. Show me every piece of paper you have." They worked by lamplight until the early hours of the morning, comparing documents, tracing dates, looking for inconsistencies. The allotment certificate bore the signature of a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent named J.T. Whitmore. The surveyor's plat showed boundaries that matched Kanji's description. But the dates were odd. The survey had been conducted in June of 1888, but the certificate was not issued until March of 1890, nearly 2 years later. "Why the delay?" Evangeline asked. The agent said there were administrative complications, overlapping claims. She pulled out Thomas Birch's ledger and map. The boundaries in Birch's homestead claim overlapped with the southern edge of Kanji's allotment by nearly 40 acres. "What if the same land was assigned twice?" she said slowly. "What if the Bureau gave you a certificate for land that was already claimed under the Homestead Act? Then my allotment would be invalid. Or Birch's claim would be invalid, depending on which document the judge considers legitimate." She looked up at him. "That is what Cutter is counting on. Confusion, overlapping claims. He has papers that say he bought Birch's land at auction. You have papers that say the Bureau assigned it to you. The judge will see a mess and rule for the party who seems more reliable." Kanji's expression darkened. "Reliable meaning white?" "Yes." They sat in silence, the weight of it pressing down like a physical thing. Then Evangeline said, "What if we force Cutter to admit the auction was fraudulent? If we can prove he killed Birch or paid someone to do it, the whole chain of title collapses." "And how do we prove that Birch is dead?" "Doyle ruled it an accident. There are no witnesses." "Doyle," Evangeline said slowly. "He seemed different today. Troubled. What if he knows something?" Kanji studied her. "You want to ask the sheriff to betray his employer? I want to give him the chance to do the right thing." The next day, Evangeline rode alone to White River and found Sheriff Doyle at his office, a small building beside the courthouse. He looked up when she entered, unsurprised. "I wondered if you would come," he said. "You said I had an ally," Evangeline replied. "I need to know if you meant it." Doyle leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "This is my personal ledger," he said. "I have kept records of everything I have done as sheriff. Every investigation, every ruling, every bribe I took." His voice was bitter. "I told myself I was just trying to survive. That Cutter owned this valley, and there was no point fighting him. But the truth is, I was a coward." He opened the notebook to a page marked with a ribbon. "Thomas Birch, September 1882. I was called to investigate his death. Found him at the bottom of a ravine near his homestead. Skull cracked. Could have been a fall. Could have been something else." "What made you suspicious?" Two things. First, Birch was an experienced rider. The ravine was not that steep. Second, I found fresh hoof prints near the body, 2 horses. Birch only owned one. Doyle's jaw tightened. I asked Cutter about it. He said his men had been checking fence lines in the area, said it was a coincidence. Then he offered me $200 to rule it an accidental death and close the case. And you took it. I took it. Doyle's eyes were bleak. I have been taking his money ever since. But I drew the line at separating children from their mother. That is a sin I cannot stomach. Evangeline leaned forward. Will you testify at the judge's inspection? If I do, Cutter will destroy me. He has enough dirt on me to see me hanged. Then we will all go down together, Evangeline said, or we will all walk away free. Doyle studied her for a long moment. Then he closed the notebook and slid it across the desk. Take this, he said. Use it however you need to. But understand, once this comes out, my life in this valley is over. Mine might be too, Evangeline said quietly. But at least we will have tried. The morning of November 14th, 1890 dawned cold and clear, the sky a pale, merciless blue. Judge Augustus Blackwell arrived at 10 o'clock in a mud-spattered carriage accompanied by his clerk and a federal marshal named Teague, a hard-eyed man with a Spencer carbine slung across his back. Sheriff Doyle rode alongside, his face set like stone. Behind them came Abraham Cutter on a tall roan gelding flanked by Skinny Steve and 4 other cowhands. But also behind them came others. Seamus O'Malley, limping on his twisted ankle, arrived on a borrowed mule. Widow McCready came in her wagon, her 3 daughters perched in the back. The Johansson brothers rode up on matching plow horses. Dr. Jasper arrived, last medical bag in hand, looking like a man walking to the gallows. By the time everyone had assembled in the yard, there were nearly 30 people present, more than anyone, including Cutter, had anticipated. Judge Blackwell, a tall, stooped man with white mutton chops and a frock coat gone shiny at the elbows, surveyed the crowd with evident displeasure. This is an official inspection, not a public gathering, he said. These are witnesses, Your Honor, Evangeline said, stepping forward. Relevant witnesses to the matters under review. Blackwell frowned but nodded. Very well. Let us proceed. They gathered on the porch and in the yard. The judge sat in a chair brought from the house, his clerk beside him with a notebook. Cutter stood to one side, arms folded, confident. Kanji stood near the door, Winona and the other children behind him. Evangeline stood in the center, the contract in her hand, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must hear it. Judge Blackwell cleared his throat. Mrs. Evangeline Helene, you are the signatory to a contract of domestic guardianship with the Ladies' Charitable Committee of White River, which places you in a position of legal oversight regarding this property. Is that correct? It is, Your Honor. And you have been summoned here to provide testimony regarding the suitability of this environment for the rearing of minor children. Do you understand the gravity of your testimony? I do. Then proceed. Evangeline took a breath. This was the moment. She could feel Cordelia Finch's presence like a weight, even though the woman had chosen not to attend, confident in her legal snare. Your Honor, she began. I was brought here under false pretenses. I was told this was a simple employment agreement. I was not informed that it contained clauses making me a legal guardian of property, nor that my testimony could be used to seize that property from its rightful owner. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cutter's expression tightened. Judge Blackwell raised a hand for silence. You claim you did not understand the terms you signed. I claim the terms were deliberately obscured. But more importantly, Your Honor, I claim that the entire premise of this contract is based on fraud. Now Cutter stepped forward. Your Honor, this is absurd. The woman is clearly being coached. Mr. Cutter, you will have your opportunity to speak. Mrs. Helene, explain yourself. Evangeline held up Thomas Birch's ledger and the surveyor's map. These documents belong to a homesteader named Thomas Birch who filed a claim on this land in 1881. According to his own records, he was working the claim as late as September of 1882. But in October of that year, the county records show his claim was declared abandoned and sold at auction to Abraham Cutter. She laid the documents on the makeshift table in front of the judge. The problem, Your Honor, is that Thomas Birch was still alive in September. His grave unmarked lies a mile east of here. Sheriff Doyle investigated his death and ruled it accidental. But the timing is suspicious, and the boundaries described in Cutter's auction sale overlap with the allotment assigned to Kanji Redhawk by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1890. Judge Blackwell picked up the ledger, frowning. You are suggesting Mr. Cutter acquired this land illegally? I am suggesting someone killed Thomas Birch to make his claim available for purchase. And I am suggesting the Bureau of Indian Affairs then assigned the same land to Mr. Redhawk either through ignorance or because they did not consider Cutter's title legitimate. Cutter's face went red. This is slander. I purchased that land legally at a county auction. I have the deed. Then, explain the overlap, Mr. Cutter. Evangeline said, her voice cold. Explain why Thomas Birch's surveyor's map shows boundaries that match Mr. Redhawk's allotment. Explain why a man who was farming his land in September was declared dead and abandoned by October. Accidents happen on the frontier, Mrs. Helene. Men die. That does not make me a murderer. No, she said, but it does make you a thief. The yard erupted. Cutter lunged forward, his hand going to his belt. Skinny Steve and the other cowhands moved with him, but Marshal Teague stepped between them, carbine raised. Nobody moves, Teague said flatly. Judge Blackwell slammed his hand on the table. Order, I will have order. The crowd quieted, but the tension crackled like lightning about to strike. Blackwell looked at Evangeline. Do you have any proof beyond these documents that Mr. Cutter was involved in Birch's death? I do, Your Honor. Evangeline turned to Sheriff Doyle. Sheriff, will you tell the judge what you told me? All eyes turned to Doyle. He stood very still, his face pale, hands clenched at his sides. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped forward. Your Honor, Doyle said, his voice rough. I need to make a confession. He pulled the leather-bound notebook from his coat and held it up for all to see. This is my personal ledger. It contains records of every investigation I conducted as sheriff, including the death of Thomas Birch in 1882. He opened it to the marked page. When I examined Birch's body, I found evidence suggesting it was not an accident. Fresh hoofprints from 2 horses near the scene, bruising on his body consistent with a struggle. But Abraham Cutter paid me $200 to rule it an accidental death and close the case. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cutter's face went from red to white. You are lying, Cutter snarled. You have no proof. I have this. Doyle pulled a second document from the notebook, a yellowed receipt. Your payment, Mr. Cutter. Signed by you. Dated October 1882, the same month Birch's claim went to auction. Judge Blackwell held out his hand, but Doyle gave him both the notebook and the receipt. As Blackwell read, the silence in the yard was absolute. Finally, the judge looked up, his expression carved from stone. Mr. Cutter, this is damning evidence. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Cutter's jaw worked. He glanced at Skinny Steve, a look passing between them that spoke of desperation and calculation. Then Cutter turned back to the judge, his voice hardening. "Your Honor, this is a circus. I came here in good faith, and I am being slandered by a corrupt sheriff, a foreign widow, and an Indian who should never have been given land in the first place. I demand." "You demand nothing, Mr. Cutter." Judge Blackwell's voice was cold. He set down the documents and looked at the federal marshal. "Marshal Teague, I am ordering a full criminal investigation into the death of Thomas Birch and the circumstances of the land auction in 1882. I am also suspending any action on the Redhawk allotment pending that investigation. Furthermore, I am voiding the contract between Mrs. Helene and the Ladies' Committee Sections 7 and 8 as unconscionable and unenforceable." Relief flooded through Evangeline so powerfully she thought her knees would buckle. But Cutter was not finished. "This is not over," he snarled. He turned to his men. "Mount up. We are leaving." "Not yet, Mr. Cutter." Marshal Teague blocked his path. "I have questions for you regarding Sheriff Doyle's testimony and this receipt. You will accompany me to White River." "I will not." "Then I will place you under arrest." For a moment, Cutter looked as though he might refuse. His hand twitched toward his hip, where a revolver hung in a tooled leather holster. Skinny Steve and the other cowhands tensed. But then Cutter seemed to recalculate. He was outnumbered, and the federal marshal had legal authority that even he could not ignore. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But this is not over, Redhawk. You hear me? This is not over." He turned and stalked toward his horse. His men followed, but Skinny Steve lingered, his eyes cold and calculating, as he surveyed the homestead one last time. Then they rode away. The crowd in the yard began to disperse, people shaking Kanji's hand, clapping Evangeline on the shoulder, offering congratulations. Seamus embraced Dr. Jasper, thanking him for his courage. Widow Macready wept openly relief, pouring out in great, shuddering sobs. Judge Blackwell packed his papers into his leather satchel and spoke quietly to Kanji. "You understand, this is only a reprieve, Mr. Redhawk. The investigation will take time. Cutter has powerful friends in Cheyenne. You must remain vigilant." "I understand, Your Honor." "And you, Mrs. Helene." Blackwell turned to her. "You have made a formidable enemy today. If I were you, I would consider moving somewhere safer. With respect, Your Honor." Evangeline said, "This is my home now. I am not leaving." Blackwell nodded slowly. "Then I wish you luck. You will need it." He climbed into his carriage and departed, the marshal riding alongside with Cutter and his men in tow. Sheriff Doyle lingered behind. He approached Evangeline, his hat in his hands. "I know I do not deserve your thanks," he said quietly. "But I want you to know, doing the right thing today was the first decent act I have committed in years. It felt good." "What will you do now?" Evangeline asked. "Leave the territory, I suppose. Find a place where no one knows my name. Try to live with what I have done." He looked at Kanji. "I am sorry for the years I turned a blind eye. For what it is worth, your wife and daughter deserved better justice than I gave them." Kanji studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. It was not forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Doyle mounted his horse and rode away alone. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the valley in shades of amber and rust, the homestead finally quieted. The last of the visitors had gone home. The children were inside chattering excitedly about the day's drama, their voices bright with relief. Evangeline stood on the porch watching the light fade, feeling the weight of the day slowly lift from her shoulders. Kanji emerged from the barn, carrying a bucket of fresh water for the horses. He set it down and climbed the porch steps, standing beside her. "We won," he said quietly. For now, she replied. Cutter will not let this go. No, but we bloodied him today. He will be more careful, and perhaps less confident. They stood in companionable silence, watching the first stars prick the deepening blue. Thank you, Kanji said. You did not have to fight for me. You could have walked away. Where would I walk to? She looked at him, and for the first time allowed herself to truly see him, not as an employer, not as an alliance of necessity, but as a man who had shown her quiet kindness, who had protected her children, who had shared his grief and made room for hers. You gave me and my boys a home when we had nothing. You trusted me even though you had no reason to. I was not going to let Cutter steal that. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm, calloused from work, and his grip was firm. When this is over, he said, when the investigation is finished and the land is secure, will you stay? Her throat tightened. Do you want me to? Yes. Then I will stay. He nodded, and she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away, not just gratitude, but hope. They stood like that, hand in hand, as the night deepened around them. But Cutter's men came that very night. They did not hear the riders until it was too late. The sound came all at once, pounding hooves, shouting voices, the crack of a whip. Evangeline spun toward the pasture, just as a herd of longhorns exploded out of the darkness, driven hard and fast, straight toward the homestead. Skinny Steve and two cowhands' faces wrapped in bandanas rode behind the herd, whooping and firing pistols into the air, driving the animals into a blind panic. Inside, Kanji roared. Everyone inside now. But there was no time. The herd was already splitting around the house, a river of horns and muscle. The ground shaking under the weight of 40 head of cattle moving at a dead run. The chickens exploded in panicked squawks. One longhorn slammed into the corner post of the porch, and the whole structure shuddered violently. Kanji grabbed Evangeline and pulled her back against the wall of the house, shielding her with his body as the herd thundered past. A steer caught its horn on the porch railing and ripped it clean off, splinters flying like shrapnel. Inside, the children were screaming. A section of the chicken coop collapsed under the onslaught, boards flying. One struck Henry across the shoulder as he tried to herd Tallulah and Luke toward the root cellar. He went down with a cry, clutching his arm. Evangeline tore free from Kanji and ran toward her son. A longhorn veered toward her eyes, rolling white with panic. She dove aside, hitting the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs. The steer's hoof missed her head by inches, leaving a divot in the earth where her skull had been. Kanji fired the Winchester into the air, the crack of the rifle momentarily scattering the nearest animals. But the herd's momentum was too great. They surged through the yard, trampling the garden, smashing the water trough, reducing months of work to ruin in seconds. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The last of the cattle thundered past, vanishing into the darkness beyond the cottonwoods. Skinny Steve and his men wheeled their horses and rode hard for the ridge, disappearing before Kanji could get off a clear shot. Silence fell, broken only by the moaning of the wind and Henry's ragged sobbing. Evangeline crawled to her son. His shoulder was dislocated, the arm hanging at a grotesque angle, and a deep gash ran from his collarbone to his upper arm, blood soaking his shirt. "Ma," he gasped, tears streaming down his face. "Ma, it hurts so bad." "I know, sweetheart, I know." She pressed her apron to the wound, trying to stanch the bleeding. "Kanji, I need help." Kanji was already there, kneeling beside them. He examined the injury with swift, practiced hands. "The shoulder is out. I need to set it now before it swells." "Do it," Evangeline said, her voice shaking. Kanji braced Henry's torso with one hand and gripped the boy's wrist with the other. "This will hurt," he said, meeting Henry's terrified eyes. But it will be fast. Can you be brave? Henry nodded, biting his lips so hard it bled. Kanji pulled hard and rotated. There was a sickening pop, and Henry screamed a raw, agonized sound that tore through the night. But the shoulder slid back into place. "Good boy," Kanji said quietly, his hand gentle on Henry's uninjured shoulder. "You are very brave. Your father would be proud." Dr. Jasper, who had been preparing to leave when the attack began, rushed over with his medical bag. He cleaned and stitched the gash by lantern light, 23 careful stitches, while Evangeline held her son and murmured reassurances she did not feel. The other children huddled together on the porch, shaken but unhurt. Peter's face was white with shock. Luke clung to Winona, hiccuping with fear. When Jasper finished, he looked at Kanji and Evangeline with grim eyes. This was not an accident. This was attempted murder. "I know," Kanji said, his voice flat and dangerous. "You need to report this to Marshal Teague, immediately." "I will. But first, we need to make sure it does not happen again." They did not sleep that night. Kanji and Maddo took turns standing watch, rifles loaded, while Evangeline tended to Henry and tried to comfort the younger children. Peter, shaken and pale, insisted on helping his mother, acting older than his 11 years. At dawn, Kanji rode hard for White River to report the attack. He returned 2 hours later with Marshal Teague, who examined the trampled yard, the destroyed coop, the hoofprints leading toward Cutter's ranch. "I will arrest Skinny Steve and the others if I can find them." Teague said, his expression grim. "But proving Cutter ordered this will be harder. He is already claiming ignorance, says his men acted without his knowledge." "Then arrest him too," Evangeline said, fury burning in her chest. "I need evidence, ma'am, not suspicion." "You have our testimony," which he denies. Teague's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I believe you. But a judge needs more than belief. I need witnesses who will testify under oath that they saw Cutter give the order. Or I need one of his men to turn on him." After the marshal left, Kanji and Evangeline stood in the ruined yard, surveying the damage. The chicken coop was kindling. The garden was trampled to mud. Henry lay inside with his arm bound in a sling, pale and feverish from the pain. "This will not stop," Kanji said quietly. "Even if Teague arrests Skinny Steve, Cutter will hire more men. He has too much to lose." "Then what do we do?" "We finish him." Kanji's eyes were hard. "We do not wait for the law. We bait him into making a mistake so big, so public, that even his friends in Cheyenne cannot protect him." "How?" "We file a formal counterclaim. Using Birch's ledger and map, we demand not just validation of my allotment, but the return of the 40 acres Cutter stole. We take the fight to him." Evangeline's breath caught. "That will enrage him." "Yes. And when a man is enraged, he stops thinking clearly. He makes mistakes. It is dangerous. Everything is dangerous." He looked at her, and she saw the fierce determination in his eyes. "But I would rather die fighting than live on my knees." They filed the counterclaim the next day. By evening, the whole valley knew. Cutter's response came swiftly. He sent word through intermediaries that he was willing to negotiate a settlement, meaning he would drop his claim to Kanji's land if Kanji withdrew the counterclaim and left the valley permanently. Kanji refused. 3 days later, Cutter sent a different message, a final offer. Meet him at the old wash near the Birch homestead at midnight. Come alone. They would settle this like men. It was a trap. Kanji knew it. Evangeline knew it. But it was also an opportunity. "I will go," Kanji said. "But I will not go alone. You and Seamus and the Johansson brothers will be hidden nearby. If Cutter tries anything, you will be witnesses. And this time, we will have proof. And if he simply shoots you, Evangeline asked, her voice tight with fear, then you will have seen it, and he will hang. That is not comfort. It is not meant to be. He touched her face gently, a brief, tender gesture. But it is the only way to end this. Midnight found Kanji riding alone toward the wash moonlight, painting the land in shades of silver and shadow. The wind carried the smell of sagebrush and cold stone. He dismounted 50 yards from the meeting place and walked the rest of the way on foot, Winchester in hand. Abraham Cutter was already there, standing beside his horse, a lantern at his feet, casting long, wavering shadows. Skinny Steve and 2 other men stood behind him, hands near their guns. "You came," Cutter said. "I was not sure you would." "You asked to talk," Kanji said. "So talk. I will make this simple." Cutter's voice was calm, almost pleasant. "You sign over the allotment. You take your family and leave. I will give you $500 and safe passage to the Montana Territory. No one gets hurt. And if I refuse, then you die here, tonight. Your body will be found a week from now at the bottom of this wash. Another tragic accident." Cutter smiled. "The widow and her boys will be taken by the county. Your children will be sent to a mission school in the Dakotas. And I will have the land I should have had 8 years ago." Kanji's grip tightened on the rifle. "You killed Thomas Birch." "I did what was necessary. Birch was a fool. He thought the law would protect him." Cutter's smile widened. "The law protects whoever pays for it. Not anymore." Cutter's smile faded. "You think today's hearing changed anything? Doyle is a coward and a drunk. His testimony is worthless. Judge Blackwell is old and tired. The investigation will drag on for months, maybe years. And in the meantime, accidents will keep happening. Your well will run dry. Your crops will fail. Your children will get hurt. Eventually, you will leave. Or you will die. Or you will." Cutter laughed. "You are alone, Redhawk. You are outgunned. And no one is coming to save you." "He is not alone." The voice came from the darkness above the wash. Evangeline stepped into view on the ridge, the greener's shotgun in her hands, aimed squarely at Cutter. Beside her, Seamus and the Johansson brothers emerged from cover, rifles raised. From the opposite ridge, Marshal Teague appeared with 2 deputies, their weapons trained on Skinny Steve and the other cowhands. "Drop your guns," Teague called. "You are all under arrest." For a moment, no one moved. Then Skinny Steve made his choice. He drew his revolver and fired at Teague. The night exploded. Teague's deputies returned fire. One of Cutter's men went down, clutching his leg. Skinny Steve dove for cover behind a boulder, still firing. Kanji lunged at Cutter, tackling him before he could reach his horse. They went down in a tangle, rolling across the rocky ground. Cutter's fist connected with Kanji's jaw, snapping his head back. Kanji drove his elbow into Cutter's ribs, feeling bone crack. Cutter scrambled for the revolver at his belt. Kanji grabbed his wrist, and they struggled, the gun between them. It fired. The bullet went wide, ricocheting off stone with a high, keening whine. Evangeline fired the shotgun, the blast deafening. Skinny Steve, trying to flank Teague's position, took the full load of buckshot in the chest and went down hard, not moving. The remaining cowhand threw down his gun and raised his hands, shouting, "I surrender, I surrender." Cutter, seeing his men defeated, made one last desperate play. He shoved Kanji hard, breaking free, and ran for his horse. Kanji fired the Winchester. The bullet caught Cutter in the thigh, and he went down with a scream, tumbling toward the edge of the wash. Kanji ran after him, but the ground gave way beneath his boots, loose shale and gravel, unstable in the dark. He felt himself sliding, the wash's steep wall crumbling under his weight. He scrabbled for a handhold, fingers closing on a jutting rock. His boots swung free over open air. Below in the darkness, he could hear the clatter of stones falling, a 20-foot drop onto jagged rocks. Kanji. Evangeline's scream tore through the night. She was there in an instant, dropping to her knees at the edge, reaching down. "Take my hand." He looked up at her, saw the terror in her face, and reached. Their hands clasped. She pulled with all her strength, her boots braced against the unstable ground. For a terrible moment, he thought they would both go over. Then Seamus was there, grabbing her waist, adding his strength to hers. Together, they hauled Kanji up and over the edge, all three of them collapsing in a heap on solid ground. For a moment, they just lay there gasping. Then Evangeline threw her arms around Kanji, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. "Do not ever do that again," she said, her voice shaking. "Do you hear me? Never." "I will try." He managed, his heart still pounding. Marshal Teague and his deputies rounded up the survivors. Cutter, bleeding and cursing, was dragged to his feet and placed in irons. The cowhand who had surrendered was also arrested. Skinny Steve's body was wrapped in canvas and tied across a horse. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I have ever seen," Teague said to Kanji as they made their way back to the horses. "But it worked. Cutter confessed to Birch's murder in front of witnesses. He is done." The trial that followed was swift. Abraham Cutter was convicted of murder, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to hang. The sentence was carried out 3 months later in Cheyenne on a cold February morning with a crowd of 200 witnesses. The cowhand who had surrendered testified against Cutter in exchange for a reduced sentence. He served 5 years and was never seen in the valley again. Sheriff Rupert Doyle, his testimony having helped secure the conviction, left the territory as he had promised. Rumors said he went to Oregon and took work as a farmhand under a different name, trying to live quietly with his guilt. Mrs. Cordelia Finch was charged with fraud and conspiracy. She fled before trial, and a warrant was issued for her arrest. She was never found. The Ladies' Charitable Committee was disbanded, and its remaining funds were distributed to families who had been defrauded by the contract scheme. Judge Augustus Blackwell issued a formal ruling declaring Kanji Redhawk's allotment valid, permanent, and untouchable. The 40 disputed acres were officially added to Kanji's holding. The ruling set a legal precedent that protected dozens of other Lakota allotments across the territory. By the time spring came, the valley had changed. The homestead bore the scars of battle. The chicken coop was rebuilt stronger than before. The porch was repaired, the broken railing replaced. The trampled garden was tilled and replanted. Barbed wire still ringed the property, but it was no longer a symbol of siege. It was simply a boundary respected and unchallenged. Inside the house, life found a new rhythm. Evangeline and Kanji worked side by side through the planting season, turning soil sowing seed, tending the irrigation ditches that carried water from the creek that was now finally undeniably theirs. The children, all 6 of them, grew and thrived. Peter became the steady anchor of the household, serious and responsible beyond his years. Henry, marked by the long scar on his shoulder, but not diminished by it, grew fierce and protective, a boy becoming a man. Luke remained stubborn and bright, asking endless questions and challenging every assumption. Winona blossomed into a young woman of quiet strength, Matto into a young man of sharp intelligence, and Tallulah into a girl who saw the world with clear, unflinching eyes. They were in every way that mattered a family. One warm evening in late April, Kanji came in from the fields with a cut on his forearm, not deep, but bleeding steadily. He had caught it on a strand of barbed wire while repairing a fence. Evangeline made him sit at the table. She heated water, tore a clean strip of cloth, and cleaned the wound with careful, gentle touches. "You should be more careful," she said softly, wrapping the bandage. "I am always careful," he replied, watching her face. "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "You are always fearless. That is different." He caught her wrist, gently holding it. "So are you." For a long moment they stayed like that, her hand against his arm, his fingers warm around her wrist. Then he said, "Evangeline, I need to ask you something." Her heart began to beat faster. "Yes. When you came here, you had nothing. I had nothing. We were both broken people trying to survive." He paused, searching for words. "But now we have something. We have built something. Together." He released her wrist and took her hand properly, holding it between both of his. "I do not know all the white man's customs for this," he continued. "I do not have a gold ring or pretty speeches. But I know that I do not want to live without you. I know that you are the strongest, bravest person I have ever met. I know that you have healed something in me I thought was broken forever. And I know that I love you." Tears pricked Evangeline's eyes. For so long she had felt guilty for surviving Thomas, for moving forward, for finding happiness again. But grief and memory were not the same thing. Loving Kanji did not erase what she had felt for Thomas. It simply meant she was still alive, still capable of joy. "I love you too," she whispered. He smiled then, a rare full smile that transformed his face. "Then will you stay? Not as a housekeeper, not as a legal guardian, but as my wife?" She did not hesitate. "Yes." He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. She rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and for the first time in years felt completely at peace. Behind them in the doorway, 6 children watched and grinned. They were married in June in a simple ceremony conducted by a traveling Methodist preacher. Dr. Josiah Jasper stood as witness, along with Seamus O'Malley, the Johansson brothers, and Marshall Teague, who had become a friend. A dozen homesteaders attended, people who had once been strangers, but were now allies and neighbors. Winona braided wildflowers into Evangeline's hair. Peter stood solemn and proud beside Kanji, acting as groomsman. The younger children, scrubbed and dressed in their best clothes, fidgeted through the vows, but cheered loudly when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. It was not a grand affair. There was no white silk dress, no formal banquet, no towering cake. But there was joy and laughter, and music played on Seamus's fiddle, and dancing under the stars. That night, as they lay in the darkness of their room, the room that was now truly theirs, shared and equal, Evangeline rested her head on Kanji's chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Yes." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, at peace for the first time in years. 15 years later, in the spring of 1905, the homestead had grown. New fields stretched toward the creek, their furrows straight and deep. A second barn stood beside the first, larger and sturdier. A windmill, modern, efficient, turned lazily in the wind, pumping water into a stock tank that served not just their livestock, but also Seamus O'Malley's cattle and the Johansson brothers' horses. Cooperation, not competition, had become the valley's new currency. The house itself had been expanded, a second story added to accommodate the growing family. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the smell of fresh bread and roasting venison. In the yard, a young woman, tall, dark-haired, with her father's eyes and her mother's determined chin, helped a boy of about 10 harness a horse to a spring wagon. This was Sarah Redhawk Helene, the daughter Evangeline and Kanji had welcomed 3 years after their marriage, named for Kanji's mother and Evangeline's grandmother. Peter Helene, now 26, lived on his own homestead 3 miles east, with his wife, a schoolteacher from Cheyenne, and their 2 young sons. He had become a leader in the valley's irrigation cooperative, respected by ranchers and farmers alike for his fairness and his engineering skill. Henry, 24, had become the valley's most skilled hunting guide and tracker. The scar on his shoulder was a mark of pride, now a story he told to wide-eyed children about the night his family stood against an empire. He had married a Lakota woman from the Pine Ridge Reservation, and they were raising twin daughters who spoke both English and Lakota with equal fluency. Luke, 21, wore a deputy marshal's badge and rode circuit through the new state of Wyoming, carrying the law to places that needed it most. He was known for his fairness, his courage, and his refusal to look the other way when powerful men broke the rules. Matto Redhawk had gone east to study law at Howard University in Washington, D.C., determined to defend native land rights against the predations of men like Cutter. He returned each summer, bringing with him stories of the changing world and an unshakable commitment to justice. Winona had married Dr. Jasper's former apprentice, now a practicing physician, and had become the region's first recognized native midwife. She had delivered more than 60 babies in the past 5 years, including her own 2 sons. Her calm competence and healing knowledge made her indispensable to the valley. Tallulah Redhawk, quiet and thoughtful, had become a teacher at the valley's first proper schoolhouse, a building funded by a combination of homesteader contributions and public funds from the new state government secured by Matto's legal advocacy. She taught children of every background, white, Lakota, Irish, German. In her classroom, the future was being built one lesson at a time. They all came home for Sunday dinners, filling the expanded house with noise and laughter and the joyful chaos of grandchildren. But today was a quiet day, just Evangeline and Kanji and Sarah. They stood together on the ridge above the homestead, the same ridge where Abraham Cutter had once watched and plotted. Now it was simply a place to see the land they had fought so hard to keep. The creek still ran silver through the valley, the cottonwoods still swayed in the wind, and the fields still stretched toward the horizon in waves of green and gold. "Do you remember the day I arrived?" Evangeline asked, her hair now streaked with silver, her hands still strong from years of work. "Every moment," Kanji replied. His braids were more gray than black, now his face lined by weather and time, but his eyes were still steady. "I thought you would leave within a week." "I almost did," she smiled. "I was terrified." "So was I." She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "We did well," he said quietly. "Against all odds, we did well." "We did," she agreed. "And our children will do even better." Sarah, overhearing, looked up from where she was helping the boy with the harness. "Tell me the story again, Ma, about the night you stood above the stampede with fire in your hands." Evangeline laughed. "You have heard that story 100 times. Tell it again anyway." So Evangeline told it, the whole story, from the stagecoach accident to the courtroom confrontation to the midnight showdown at the wash. She told it the way she always did, honestly, without embellishment, letting the truth speak for itself. When she finished, Sarah said, "I want to be like you when I grow up, brave and strong and not afraid of anything." "I was afraid of everything," Evangeline said. "But I did it anyway. That is what courage is." Kanji pressed a kiss to her temple. "Come. The sun is setting and there is still work to do." They walked down from the ridge together, hand in hand, as the sky turned gold and crimson. Below them, the homestead glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming, a beacon in the gathering dusk. It was not the life either of them had expected. It had been harder, bloodier, more painful than anything they could have imagined when that stagecoach first rattled into Bronze Canyon Valley 15 years ago. But it was theirs. It was home. And it was enough.